Medical experts have raised concerns about the proposed regulations to incorporate the COVID-19 special regulations into the general health regulations. Now, they say the amended regulations resemble a haphazard cutting and pasting of the emergency measures. The Department of Health, you will recall, published these regulations for comment, and this is before they are brought in as official law, if you like. Joining me now is Ignatius Viljoen, and he is from the Institute for Cellular and Molecular Medicine at the University of Pretoria, but he talks to us from Adelaide in Australia. Mr. Viljoen, thank you very much for your time. At least you are spared load shedding where you are. Talk to us about why you are concerned about what is about to happen, the merger of emergency measures to contain COVID-19 into the regular measures that have already or that are always there anyway in the health sector to try and manage any disease that is seen as an emergency.
Yes, sorry, thank you very much for the opportunity. This is in response to an article that was published in the Conversation a few days ago. We have basically three concerns. The one is that the regulations as they are proposed may infringe on our rights as citizens. The second one is that the regulations, some of them are actually redundant and shouldn't be there. And the third thing is that what we see is that these regulations seem to be a cutting and pasting of the special COVID regulations. Now, briefly about the rights issue. South Africa has an excellent constitution, and the second chapter of the constitution is our Bill of Rights. And I don't think us as South Africans we always appreciate what the value of those rights are. Now, some of these rights may be limited from time to time under extreme conditions, such as natural disasters or national emergencies, this type of thing. But then the limitation of those rights are restricted to a limited period of time. For example, in a national emergency, the Parliament must revise or reconsider them every 21 days. In the case of a national disaster, they can initially be limited for 3 months, and thereafter they have to be monthly revised. Now, if you were to incorporate regulations that limit a person's human rights, you cannot just incorporate them into general regulations. These regulations should only be enacted under severe conditions.
Yeah.
And so that raises a concern.
All right. And so you've dealt, I suppose, in large part in this first response with the measures that you say are infringing or likely to infringe on the rights of citizens in terms of what the Constitution says. Let's deal with number two. You're saying some of the regulations that are out for public comment, they are redundant. Which are those?
Well, one of the major portions of this proposed regulations aims to insert a set of new regulations, Section 15, 8 new regulations under the existing Section 15. Now, we have an act that deals with transmissible diseases, and so we find then that the current act makes provision that people can be tested voluntarily, they can be placed under quarantine, they can be isolated. That is in the existing act. All of these measures are provided for. So we think it is really unnecessary now to make a new regulation that says that people can be tested and isolated if it's necessary. Secondly, the existing regulations already provide for it that if a person does not voluntarily want to submit to testing if there's a strong suspicion that they've been infected, then he could be ordered by a court to submit to testing and all of these other things. So it's not really necessary to, again, make a new regulation and a different regulation to regulate exactly the same thing that is already in place. And this basically cuts back to this cutting and pasting exercise. So under the COVID regulations, we see that special regulations were made to deal with the COVID situation, and it appears that whoever drafted these proposed regulations didn't really look at what is already in the existing regulations, and they just took sections of this COVID regulations and are now trying to plug it into the general regulations.
All right.
And
So I'm sorry to cut in there. There's one specific element I'd like to touch on, Mr. Viljoen, and this has to do with the personal data of the patients. There's one section in this article where you say, and I quote now, researchers should be prevented from monetizing data without patient consent, and that's in relation to the promulgation of the Protection of Personal Information Act. What are the major concerns there?
Okay, so we must remember that these COVID regulations were published before the Prevention of Poppy Act was actually promulgated. So it is necessary that the regulations, that any regulation should be aligned. Legislation should speak to each other. So you cannot have one set of regulations in one act and others in another act. That leads to confusion, and it will eventually end up with placing a larger burden on the courts to decide which is now more important. Now, as far as personal data is concerned, it is important that when testing data about people who suffer from communicable diseases are collected, that the data must be anonymized after some period of time, because you don't want people to be victimized or stigmatized because someone can identify X, Y, or Z has had this specific disease. So it must be totally anonymized. The second part of it is, in the process of collecting these samples, genetic material of people are also collected. Now, currently, access to genetic material is a very valuable scientific resource. And all that we say is, if a person's genetic material is collected and it's going to be used in future, then that person should give proper written consent to it. Now, we've all probably had these PCR tests and all kinds of tests taken. Nowhere during those tests did anyone explain to me that my genetic material may be used for further research.
All right.
So I've not given consent to that, and I think it should be controlled.
That's Ignatius Jacobs, or rather Ignatius Viljoen. My sincere apologies there. Thank you very much for your insights on this matter. And he is from the Institute for Molecular and Cellular Medicine at the University of Pretoria. So Institute for Cellular and Molecular Medicine at the University of Pretoria. Thank you.